Right, I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Our next speaker is Helen Lingard from RMIT, and she's a University Distinguished Professor and Director of the Centre for Construction Work Health and Safety Research. Helen has 20 years' experience advising organisations in the construction, mining and telecommunications sector on safety, health, work-life balance and wellness. Helen works closely with government and industry partners and recently completed a 5-year international benchmarking study of construction, work health and safety. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you very much to WorkSafe Tasmania and the Safety Institute of Australia for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. So today I'd like to speak to you about two separate bits of work that we've been doing, one more recent than the other. I want to talk a little bit about some health and wellbeing research that we've done over the years, but I also want to talk to you and present to you some recent analysis of some safety performance metrics that we've done, because it presents some interesting questions about how we measure safety performance and what the metrics we collect actually mean. So as a bit of background information about the research centre that I'm involved with, we've been in existence since 2012, and we work with a number of government agencies and organisations, construction organisations, industry associations and client organisations, and these are some of our partners in current projects. So making sense of safety data is the first thing that I'd like to talk to you about. Many of you will be familiar with the way that safety performance has been traditionally managed in the construction industry, and there's been a heavy reliance on what we call lag indicators, or the measurement of things that have gone wrong, things like lost time injury frequency rates and total recordable injury incident rates. And these are measures of things that have already happened. They're historical things, they're things that are negative, and they capture things that have already gone wrong. And in recent years, there's been a growing understanding that relying on measurements of things that have gone wrong is actually not that helpful, because in fact, it's better to be proactive and understand the state of health of a safety system before things go wrong. And so there has been a growing emphasis on measuring, the traditional measures of incident rates tend to be called lagging indicators. And there's been a relatively recent trend towards measuring things called leading indicators instead. And the leading indicators tend to be measurements of things that are positive, things that people are doing to actually look after safety in the workplace and to prevent injuries from actually occurring and incidents from occurring. So these leading indicators are often measures of how many safety walks, for example, a management might have undertaken, how many people have received work health and safety training, how many pre-start meetings or toolbox meetings have been conducted in a given period. So these are the sorts of things that tend to get measured as leading indicators. And in that measurement of leading indicators and traditional lagging indicators, if you like, the negative outcomes of things that have gone wrong, there is actually an underlying assumption that those two things are related, that if you measure leading indicators at one point in time, you will predict performance in incidents and injuries at a subsequent point in time. So the more leading indicators you measure, notionally at least, that the language suggests that you will actually ultimately, at some future point in time, have a reduced incident experience. And so there is this assumption that what we call leading and what we call lagging indicators are related. And this language has actually, by the way, been adopted from finance and economics. So we've adopted leading and lagging somewhat uncritically from the finance and economics domain. So we've recently done a piece of analysis to look at the relationships between leading and lagging indicator data in construction projects. And it revealed some really interesting results that I think really do challenge, in some senses, the way that we measure and understand health and safety metrics. So some of the questions that arise in this are, how do we know what leading indicators to measure? How do we know what the things are that we should measure that will tell us what our future safety performance will look like? And if we do know what we should measure, how frequently should we measure it? Should we measure it weekly? Should we measure it monthly? Should we measure it every quarter? And these are sorts of things that we need to understand, because we need to understand the relationships over time between these metrics so we can make sense of them and respond to them in an appropriate way. So we sort of need to know the time lag between a leading indicator. So if somebody does a safety walk, this week, is that going to have an impact on the site safety performance for 10 minutes, for 2 days, for a week, for a fortnight? And these are the sorts of things that we just don't know. But we assume that they're causally related somehow. So we were very fortunate in being given access to 5 years' worth of data where leading and lagging indicators had been collected over a 5-year period on a single construction project. And this was a pretty unique opportunity for us to really drill down into that data and make sense of it. This is what it looked like in the whole data set. So you can see it's very difficult to make sense of this. You can see here that they were measuring the total recordable injury frequency rate, but they were also measuring toolbox talks, the number of audits, safety audits that were took place, pre-brief meetings, safety observations, the number of times swims were reviewed, safe work method statements, and all sorts of other things. So this is what the data looked like over the 5-year period. Very hard to understand. But we actually did some statistical analysis on it that was a little bit more sort of sophisticated than simply looking just at the graph. And what we found that I think is really interesting in terms of the way these leading and lagging indicators relate to one another, we found that the expected leading indicators, all those measures of management activity, the safety walks, the pre-starts, the toolbox talks, all of those things did actually behave as lead indicators. So when they went up, the incident rate went down at a subsequent point in time. So we're right in saying that those things are, to some extent, lead indicators of safety performance. But this is the interesting bit, they also behaved as lagging indicators. And this is I think, the really interesting point. So the frequency of toolbox meetings, audits, pre-start meetings, and others all led changes in the TRIFR, the total recordable injury frequency rate, at a subsequent point in time. But they also, so changes upwards or downwards in the TRIFR were actually followed changes in the leading indicators, but also there was a significant change in the leading indicator behaviour after a change in the TRIFR. And I'll explain what that meant a little bit in a moment. And it was also interesting to note that the time lag varied significantly in between these relationships. So the data showed that the one-directional relationship that is implied by the term leading and lagging indicators, that is, if a leading indicator changes, so too does a lagging indicator, it assumes that there's a one-directional relationship, was actually not entirely, there was a one-directional relationship, but it also was cyclical. So there was this cyclical relationship. So an increase in the frequency of toolbox talks, for example, decreased the total recordable injury rate in the short term, but over an extended period, the direction switched round and the indicators changed direction, so that a change in the total recordable injury rate actually ended up causing a subsequent decrease in the frequency of toolbox talks. And we were finding a cyclical relationship. And the management activities that were expected to lead the total recordable injury rate actually appeared to be actually triggered by a change in the occurrence of incidents and injuries. And this cycle, I think, is really worth understanding when we think about how we use data, and I'll show you what it looks like graphically. So here's what the data actually was doing, and this is an oversimplification of what it looked like, but it'll give you a sense of what I'm talking about when I talk about this cycle. So this is where this is a starting point, and the blue X, which is on the vertical axis, which actually shows the total recordable injury frequency rate. The blue X is the current level of safety performance, which was above the project or site average total recordable injury frequency rate. And that was regarded as being unacceptable and demanding improvement. So you can see how we then move into a management action cycle. So the bottom line, the grey line here, shows the frequency of leading indicators. So as the safety effort increased, because that's going up, because the accident rate was deemed to be too high, that action cycle caused the increase in frequency of management behaviour that actually brought down the total recordable injury frequency rate. So the safety effort increased, the leading indicator score increases, and the total recordable injury frequency rate decreases in response to that. So we're in this action cycle. But, and this is the critical thing that was shown in the data, when you actually move on from that action cycle, the total recordable injury frequency rate comes down a little bit, and you get into what we call the comfort cycle. And in that comfort cycle, the project management team become comfortable. They're not yet alarmed, but they're comfortable because the total recordable injury frequency rate has dropped back down to what they consider to be a normal level. And as a result of that drop, so too does the management activity. That starts to drop off. That's the grey line at the bottom. So management have got a bit comfortable with things. The TRIF has come down. They pull back a little bit on some of the management activity. And then what happens after that, because the total recordable injury frequency rate has gone up again to a level that is uncomfortable for them, the safety effort again increases and they move back into the next action cycle. And the cycle just continues to repeat as the team realises the need for improvement, put more emphasis on safety until the TRIFA comes down, and then it goes back into the comfort cycle. And we observed this pattern across this 5-year data set. And I think it's really important to understand this pattern because it actually shows that over time, this incident cycle will ultimately produce no maintained improvement in the total recordable injury frequency rate because it will just remain cyclical, and that the management knee-jerk reaction to a change in the total recordable injury frequency rate doesn't lead to sustained and continued improvement. So I think it's kind of important to understand when we measure leading and lagging indicators and metrics that we might think about them as not being related just in terms of one predicts another, but they're actually reciprocally related and they create cycles over time in projects, which may or may not be helpful. In this case, it doesn't look like it is very helpful. And we statistically demonstrated this pattern in that 5-year data set, so it's interesting, I think. Of course. Yeah. There was a delay, and the delay varied depending on what leading and lagging what leading metrics we were using. So the delay varied. In some cases it was 2 weeks, in some cases it was 2 months, in some cases it was 1 month, and it varied according to what leading indicator we were looking at. This is a very simplified schematic. Yeah. But it's just to show that there is this cyclical behaviour in the data, yeah. And you're right. And because there was a different lag between the different lead indicators, you can imagine this for one lead indicator might be stretched out, and in other cases it might be compressed. But in virtually all cases, it produced a cyclical pattern of this nature. So I think it's sort of interesting data. The other thing that the research showed is that the leading indicators were very highly interrelated with one another. So in fact, the management activities that were taking place were not unrelated. And so we consider that there must be a more sophisticated way to understand the indicator data and use network techniques to actually look at the way that the things are related over time. More importantly, I think it's really important to consider other metrics of success. What can we measure that will actually predict safety success, not just incident rates? Because I think there is a move and a need to actually develop predictive models of what actually will produce good safety outcomes as opposed to just incident and injury rates. Yeah.
Research. Finding ways of improvement situations that don't just have an ongoing pattern that doesn't improve.
No, look, I think we didn't actually have the luxury of doing that because we were given like a retrospective data set to analyse. So in fact, we literally just analysed a a 5-year bunch of leading and lagging indicators. And I think moving forward, research definitely needs to look at how to actually engage management in understanding where they are in those action and comfort cycles and making sure that they actually break out of that cyclical response, because it seems to be a knee-jerk response that's very unhelpful. So I actually think that knowing that these cyclical things can occur is the first step to actually then helping managers recognise that might be what's going on and responding to it in a way that breaks that cycle.
How big a project was it?
It was a massive project. It was a 5-year infrastructure construction project with multiple packages of work and many different contractors, all reporting against the same system.
Okay, because one of the reactions that I had to the information was that you have the leading indicators having a positive impact on the lagging indicators, and then there's an incident, a serious incident, which then may forces them to recalibrate their activities and then refocus their leading indicator activities, rather than necessarily, so that might account with that cyclical approach as well, because whenever you have a serious incident, you have a major impact on the results.
Look, it might account for that as well, but the fact is that what we did see was after a certain period of time, those indicators tailed off again, so that activity kind of slipped away a little bit in terms of its frequency and perhaps its potency. We weren't able to look at the quality with which these things were being done. We were just able to look at the frequency with which they were being done. But certainly we did see these changes over time that were related to each other. And obviously that graphic looks like a very clean and cyclical curve. It didn't look like that, but statistically that was what was happening across the data set. Yeah. This is actually taken from the same data set, and I think this is interesting because it does actually link to the other little bit of work I want to talk about, and it relates to work hours. And the blue dots represent each measurement period, so each month in the analysis. And the bottom graph axis shows average hours worked by each person per month on the site. And just the interesting point to note here is that those blue dots are fairly sort of level and horizontal and stable up until about 200 hours per month. And at that point, the total recordable incident rates go up quite dramatically, sort of exponentially. So again, this sort of might say something a little bit about the impact of long work hours on incidents in projects, because it suggests that as soon as you hit that 200 average hours per person per month point, you get an exponential increase in incident rate. So I think that's another interesting thing that came out of the analysis. And as I said, it was a historical data set. We were given the very great privilege of analysing it, and we basically just mined it to see what we could find. And this was one of the things that we were able to find in the data set. So moving on from that, because it is related to work hours, I'd like to talk a little bit about some work design and health research that we've been doing. Again, this is not quite as recent as that analysis, but the Australian Strategy for Work Health and Safety talks about health and safety by design, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that in the construction industry there's a lot of attention being paid now to designing for safe structures and structures that can be constructed, maintained and used in a way that's safe and healthy for workers. However, that emphasis that's on design of safe structures hasn't always translated to design of healthy work processes. And Safe Work Australia says that workers' general health and well-being are strongly influenced by their health and safety at work, and well-designed work can improve worker health. So the next little bit of work I want to talk about is actually looking at the design of construction work itself rather than the structures that are being built. And as a bit of backdrop to this, looking in Australia currently at some of the demographic trends, we've got a massive growth in dual earner couples. The most predominant family form now is where both partners in a family work. So gone are the days of the traditional breadwinner homemaker family model, and that creates particular challenges for the design of work. We've also got an ageing population where elder care is a responsibility for many Australian workers. We've seen Australian women delaying childbirth, so we now have what they call a sandwich generation with simultaneous care for workers have simultaneous care for children and also for elders often. Young men are really demanding and expecting a more active role in family life. They actually want to be with their kids when their kids are growing up. That's a very important thing for them. And we see generational changes where current generations of workers actually do want to have a different relationship with work to baby boomers. And so this leads us to a situation where we need to design work that works for everybody. So this is a change in the family patterns from a situation where the parallel life paths in the middle here, where one person would engage in family work and another partner would engage in paid work, the breadwinner homemaker model. And we now see on the right-hand side a far greater prevalence to intersecting life paths, or the working family model, where both people in a partnership engage in paid work and family work is shared. Now, 45 hours a week is regarded as long work hours, and this is some data that we collected from construction projects in the mainland. And we see that there is a difference between workers who work on-site in construction activity and those who work in a site office and those who work in the company corporate office, but they're all over the 45-hour-a-week mark. On-site, site-based workers who engage in directly in construction work the longest hours on average, and they were reporting working 63 hours a week on average. But anyway, it doesn't matter where you're working, even if you're in a corporate office, you're still working long hours in the construction industry, according to this data. And it's also a pretty gendered issue, and this is actually just a bit of an aside, I guess, but we actually looked at male and female construction workers and the extent to which their spouse or partner worked in paid employment. And you'll see that the white bars here represent female construction workers and the hours that their partners work. And you can see that for female construction workers, the white bars, they're much more likely to have a partner who's in full-time employment, working either 35 to 49 or 50 plus hours a week. But in contrast to that, the black bars show male construction workers, spouse or partners, work arrangements, and they're much more likely to have a domestic partner who is working fewer hours, maybe working in part-time employment. So it is a gendered issue, and it's really problematic, particularly for female workers in the construction industry, because they're less likely to have somebody at home who can pick up the family-based duties that need to be done. Now, the work-to-family conflict, which has already appeared in a video, so you've seen this already, but work-to-family conflict is a phenomenon where work negatively impacts on your family life. And we've measured this using a standard measurement method, and we've looked at time-based and strain-based work interference with family. So time-based work interference with family is where you just don't have enough time to do what you need to do at home because your job consumes so much of your time. And strain-based work interference with family relates to when you feel so stressed or you're so affected by your work emotionally that when you go home you can't function well in your home life because you're stressed and you're carrying over that strain from one place to the next. And we found, again, this is our construction data from the same survey, we found that the first two columns on the left-hand side here are the construction industry data, and construction workers in Australia have higher time and strain-based work interference with family than other groups around the world in other industries. Unfortunately, we don't have construction industry data from other countries because it just isn't available, but what we can say is that compared to these other occupational groups, Australian construction workers fare pretty badly. And why that's important is because work-family interference and work-family conflict are very damaging and have all sorts of negative health impacts. So they're associated with increased stress and anxiety, with depression, with lower job satisfaction, high cholesterol, heart disease, burnout, strained family relationships, high levels of alcohol consumption, employee absenteeism and turnover, and poor diet, low levels of exercise and sleep problems. So if work is damaging your family life, it's likely to be damaging your health as well. And what's even worse is work-family conflict and burnout are actually reciprocal and mutually reinforcing. So the more work-family conflict you have, the more burnt out you get. The more burnt out you get, the less resilient you are and able to cope with work demands, and then the more work impacts on your family life. And we also have research evidence to suggest that burnout is contagious within workplaces. If you have burnt out people in your workplace, it's likely to affect others around them. And it's very, very high amongst site-based construction workers in Australia. So we looked at the extent to which support in the workplace, and indeed at home as well, but primarily in the workplace, can actually provide a protective buffer. And this is one example. This graph shows the relationship between work-to-family conflict and burnout, and it's actually emotional exhaustion, which is the most damaging facet of burnout. That's where you simply feel you're so exhausted you can't get out of bed in the morning and go to work. And what we found here is that these three lines represent the relationship between work-family conflict and burnout under three different conditions of supervisor support. So the flat line in the middle with the little triangles represents the relationship where you have a very supportive supervisor, where your supervisor is very supportive of you and will help you, will give you some flexibility, some understanding, and really be supportive. And where you have a supportive supervisor, the relationship is actually fairly level, which means that an increase in work-family conflict doesn't necessarily produce a big increase in burnout. But the steep line that runs diagonally across with the little diamonds represents low supervisor support. So that's where your supervisor is actually not supportive of you at all. And that low supervisor support, an increase in work-family conflict, very quickly, dramatically increases the level of burnout you feel. And so this is data that we collected from construction workers, and it shows that supervisor support can actually be really helpful in preventing some of the damaging impacts that can arise as a result of this work-family conflict. And so, we do know that there are some circumstances, some work environments where these things can be mitigated by certain things. And an interesting aspect about construction project-based work is that it's very variable. Projects are, workloads go up and down, schedules go up and down, project events occur, and it's not a stable playing field for people's work-life experiences. And we collected data for 21 weeks, again in a large construction project in Melbourne, and we wanted to know the impact of project events on work and family life. And you'll see here that the black solid line represents the number of hours people were working each week. That was actually measured on a 5-point scale, but the higher number, the hours, it goes. And the other lines, the dotted lines, represent satisfaction with work-life balance, capacity to complete home tasks, and capacity to complete work tasks. And what's of interest here is that over these 21 periods, you'll notice that between the weeks 13 and week 17, hours go up dramatically. That solid black line goes up very sharply. And almost identical to that increase is a massive deterioration in satisfaction with work-life balance. And indeed, the plummeting one, the one that hits the lowest point there is the ability to function at home. So you can see that family life is the thing that really suffers when work hours go up. What was interesting about this, when we actually dug around and explored why this pattern had occurred, we discovered that at week 17, there was a major project milestone to be delivered, and that everybody was working under immense pressure to meet that particular deadline. So we see here that, in fact, project events have a really important role to play and can really significantly influence people's experiences over the life of a project. And this is some data that people gave us, because when we were asking them for those questions, we were getting people to answer a little short, sharp survey every week. We were asking them to tell us what they were feeling each week. And at the time when those really big work hours were being done and when it was having such an impact, there was evidence of insufficient recovery. Insufficient recovery is when people expend psychological or physical energy at work and they need to recover so that they can come back and do a good day's work the next day. But if they don't have enough time to recover, to replenish their energy, then when they come back the next day, they have to expend more effort, greater effort to achieve the same amount of work. And people at this project were saying to us, as usual, I've got too much to do. There's not enough hours in the week. Time flies by, and you look at what you meant to achieve. You end up carrying most of it over to the next day. And I'm coming into work at 4 a.m. to get ahead. I'm sleep fatigued due to an error that occurred one morning, and that carried over for a day or two. And I think it's fair to say that working like that without sufficient recovery is not sustainable and will probably result in long-term health and also safety consequences. So flowing from that particular piece of research, we posed the question to the organisations we were working with as to whether, given that the industry uses very sophisticated planning and scheduling tools, and we have softwares that help us manage resources, manage planning and scheduling of tasks and activities and so on, can we actually use these tools to actually design project work to mitigate this? And can we actively design proper recovery opportunities into project programs? So if we know we've got to deliver a big milestone at a particular point in time, and we know people are going to be working very long hours to do that, can we then use our scheduling nous to design in some recovery opportunities subsequent to that to stop causing these high levels of work-family conflict, burnout, and ultimately illness? So that's all. Thank you.